We have audio. We have video. Okay, we are only 4 minutes late. I think that's within the standard error of the mean. First speaker is Suzanne Held from the Bristol University School of Veterinary Sciences. Is that the full name of it? And we're going to find out how smart pigs are.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to speak here today at the Animal Sentience meeting. Mike and I, we both biologists, and we work in animal behavior and animal welfare. Particularly, of course, we were looking at what makes animals tick and how does that matter for how we should keep them? What are their experiences? I'm predominantly an ethologist, so I'm particularly interested in why do animals do what they do? How does that link with their health? How can we use behavior as a readout for how they're doing, how they're feeling? And Mike has, in the last 10, 15 years, specialized really in pushing on with how we can measure and operationalize measuring emotions in animals, which again is key for our endeavor in our research group. So we bring to the study of, we come to the study of animal sentience really as biologists. So we look at it in an evolutionary framework. And one aspect of that is one reason why we do it, and particularly one of our early co-workers is interested in comparative cognition. So we're interested in where do pigs sit compared to other animals in terms of their cognitive abilities. But that particularly influenced with our first co-worker, Richard Byrne, who was a primatologist and was very interested in can pigs do what primates can do. We come to it more from the point of view of what can pigs do and how does it matter for how we should keep them and how we should treat them. So we come to it very much from an animal welfare point of view. And really, one of the analogies often used is when we think about why do we worry about animal welfare, what is it about animals that make us worry about them? So we're looking at, we may look what in the burger is the bit that actually we're ethically worried about. And of course it is the meat bit, because we have preconceived ideas about sentience in animals, but not necessarily in plants. And definitely the wider public is interested and cares, and again has ideas and cares for the welfare of this bit, but not the rest. So our science is kind of a mandated science in as much as it's biology, but it's mandated towards looking at improving and measuring animal welfare. So this sits, we sit with this in a sort of evolutionary framework and think very much about our animals having evolved behavioral responses that help them react appropriately to the environment that they find themselves in. So animals have evolved to be well adapted to particular environments. If they show well adapted, appropriate responses, they have an immediate outcome, so getting more or less food, eating toxic food or eating nutritious food. Whatever they do has fitness consequences, so results in more or fewer genes being passed on onto the next generation, and that promotes and carries on adaptation and shaping of behavioral responses that are really well adapted to the environments that the animals sit in. And cognition and affect and motivation sits squarely in this circle. So being that we're not behaviorists, but being that we believe the mind of the animal is not a black box, the mind of the animal is that which makes the animal do what it does. So its motivation, its information processing, and also its subjective experience. So we very much look at cognition and affect in an evolutionary framework, believing that it helps the adaptiveness of the animal to its environment. When we talk about cognitive process, this is how we use it. So we use cognitive processes in the sense of Sarah Shuttleworth to mean mechanisms by which animals acquire, process, store, and act on information from the environment. So it's saying nothing about conscious experience during those processes. It's just saying it's processing of environmental information and affect. It's it's subjective experiences that can be characterized by valence or arousal. So Mike and Liz have proposed sort of this two-dimensional framework, theoretical framework, where there are discrete dimensions to how an emotion is experienced or what makes up an emotion. So one is arousal, so how energized the animals, and the other one is whether the experience is a positive or subjective experience is positively or negatively experienced. And the idea being that animals are motivated and use subjective experience to draw them and remind them of actions that are going to be rewarding for them, rather than avoiding stimuli and experiences are going to be harmful or punishing for them. Okay. So in domestic animals, we have a particular conundrum because, of course, we now have different housing systems, we have different environments that they now live in, and through artificial selection, we may also have changed their hardware, so their cognitive apparatus, their brains. We may also have changed their behavioral responses. So it may be that through artificial selection, we have selected for particular behavioral traits. So as we, for example, in companion animals and dogs, we do that all the time. So there, it may be that we have a mismatch. We have created a mismatch between what the animals are adapted to in terms of their cognitive motivational and affective state apparatus. So we may have a mismatch between what the current and the ancestral environments are. So it may be that what they're equipped to do is not actually that what they need for the environments that they're currently in. Through that, it creates a potential for the cognitive processes that they have inherited and their effective systems to be maladaptive in the environment, in the current environments that they're in. So the question is all about how artificial selection has changed cognition and sort of behavioral outputs, and how well fitted cognition and affect still are to the environments that the animals now find themselves in. This is an example to just to put some meat on that. What I mean by that. So this is a group of gestating sows. So they are pregnant but not lactating, and they used to be housed individually in stalls, but that's no longer legal, and they're often kept in large groups. And you get a lot of aggression in those groups. You can get a lot of aggression, particularly if you do a lot of mixing. And one proposition is that their social cognitive apparatus is adapted to living in groups of 3 or 4 females, which is what they would do in the wild, so smaller group with larger space. And it is possible that in these kind of group sizes and densities, they're just not able to recognize the other animals in the group and be reminded of who is who in the hierarchy, and therefore have to re-establish by aggression the dominance hierarchies every time they meet animals, group members, because they are not recognized as being familiar. So the same goes for chickens, arguably, but the idea being that these group sizes, the social cognitive abilities that they have in discriminating individuals are not suited to being in these kind of group sizes, because they've involved in these kind of group sizes. Okay. So by understanding their cognitive processes, we can use this to predict conditions that are likely to affect domestic animals negatively. And what we need to know is whether they are well adapted to cognitive abilities are well adapted to current housing conditions we keep the animals in. And then, of course, key also is understanding affective state or emotion, because only that allows us to actually assess whether, if there is a mismatch between the expectation of the animals and how it's actually the environment it's finding itself in, whether this mismatch actually matters to the animal, how it's actually perceived by the animal, and therefore whether it affects their welfare. So this is thinking as welfare as being all about the subjective experiences of the animal. Okay, so going on to pigs now, what we know of wild boar, obviously they are ancestral to domestic pigs we have now. They live in small social groups, matriarchal, so a number of sows and their offspring, female offspring with the males when they reach sexual maturity leaving, and mature males only join during the breeding season. The sows isolate for farrowing and build nests. They are primarily nocturnal, pigs are, and they spend up to 8 hours foraging in their groups, in their family groups. They have sort of home ranges of several hectares that they range around, and they look for food, which is sort of spatially clumped. So they're not grazing, but the food's also clumped in time. So it's not really predictable from one day to the next, or definitely not from one season to the next where they find food. And that's sort of relevance to their social foraging behavior. And the other key thing is that they live in a sort of structurally and temporally complex environment. So they live in seasonal environments where different harvests, different plants become ripe at different times, and they live in scrub and woodlands again, that is structurally complex rather than simple grasslands. So then the big question is, what does that mean for our domestic pigs we have today? Does that tell us about their makeup, really? And just to remind, we know this, but just to remind ourselves, modern commercial breeds have not been selected for behavior. They have been selected really for production traits. So selection has gone for larger and leaner animals. By that is meant, lower body fat, faster growing, very good protein conversion, and having larger litters increasingly. So we are now, the pigs now have can have up to 16 piglets standard, whereas wild boar have about 4 to 6 per litter. Question is, where in these animals where selection hasn't been for behavior, and what has it meant for behavior selection for the other traits? And how do we know, therefore, how big the mismatch might be between that, what the animal is adapted for, and how it finds itself, the living condition it finds itself in. So here we can sort of ask, what is their natural behavior? How we know what their natural behavior is, by that is meant sort of in the sense of what is their ancestral behavior? What are they still motivated to? What will they do if they're not, if they're released into the wild? There's been a slew of studies on this, not just on pigs, also on chickens, where commercial animals have been taken out and put into natural conditions, so into large outdoor enclosures, as if wild, and people have sat down and just literally written down what they do over months and months and years, and months and months and months and months. So I've done long-term ecological observations. And the key studies here have been done in Edinburgh and in Sweden. So what we know from these is that modern domestic pigs are less active than wild boar, as in they spend less of the day roaming around, or less of the night roaming around. They have less dominance-related aggression than wild pigs, and they're less predator vigilant. But as the behavioral repertoire goes, so what do they still do as wild pigs? It's the same. So they still have the same nesting, mothering, social, sexual, and so on behaviors as wild pigs. So their motivations are as for wild pigs. Okay, so then we come to social behavior and their social cognition, which is something we've spent a bit of time studying. And here the key is, so if you think about how sows are kept in commercial conditions, I think we'll hear about that more later, but they're almost always in groups, and they're often mixed. Groups can be larger than is the natural group size, so they're more smaller. But they are social animals also in modern housing systems. And the question is, how, given the opportunity, how much do they still understand about each other, and how do they use that social knowledge that they have of each other, social understanding about each other's behavior? How do they use that in their everyday lives? And again, if we look to what they do when they are in the wild, So they are naturally social. So they live in small family groups of a few sows and their female offspring, like I've said. Then they forage in groups, and it's quite important what I was saying about how the food is distributed, because it's not always easy to find it. So when one pig finds the food, the others are immediately interested in it. So that means they constantly monitor it. In the wild, they constantly monitor what everybody else is doing and whether somebody else has found something, a good food patch. And access to these resources is through rank relationships, so dominant hierarchy. So in these groups, they have very highly differentiated rank relationships, and that sort of prevents them having to fight out when there's a competition over a resource that doesn't get fought out, but that they recognize the others in the group and will defer or challenge depending on where they are in the hierarchy. Okay, so the first thing we looked at, was whether pigs can take the visual perspective of others. And visual perspective taking is one of those high-level cognitive skills that people have looked for in a range of species, particularly in primates, because it is one of those human-like characteristics that where people see where animals are on a cognitive scale, and again, then how they should be treated. This has been rated as a sort of highly evolved social cognitive skill. And what it means is it means basically an understanding of what others can and cannot see. So, which is something that we of course have. So I can, you look at something and I have an idea of what you're looking at, but it's not clear whether animals have that or not. And of course, whether you know you have that ability or not, if you have that ability, you will respond differently to individuals in your group that can see and individuals that cannot see some critical event. And we can use this prediction we use that, and we use the animals' behavioral responses in tasks, this discrimination ability, to see whether they have visual perspective taking abilities or not. And the way that this is interpreted is that visual perspective taking is a human-like understanding about mental states of others. So this is what it says about cognitive ability. Or it is just an understanding about the behavior of others. Or if you can moderate that a bit, it's understanding about some of the mental states of others. So this is how we did it. So here's our test pig. So this is the test pig who we're testing for the ability. And the test pig sees an experimenter baiting one of these four little corridors, and each one has a football at the end, and it's got like a cat flap. So the pig, when it's released here with a sort of pig flap, runs across and enters one of these, and it learns over successive training trials to go into the one that she's seen the trainer go into, because it knows that that's where the food's going to be. So the trainer baits one of these four buckets with food. So over training, the test pig learns to watch the hiding of the food. So it learns the food is where the trainer entered. And then we test the test pig. So the testing happens like this. The test pig can't see what the trainer is doing. It just knows the trainer is baiting, can hear that the trainer is baiting. But the test pig has got this board in front, so can't see what's happening. And the test pig has got two companions. They know each other, so they won't fight. The two companions are smaller, so if there's an all-out contest for getting the food, the big pig will always win. So it knows it can. If it comes to challenging over a bucket, it will get the food. But the difference between these two companions is that this one also cannot see where the food's being hidden, but this one can. So during the baiting, this pig can't see, but it knows this one is blind to the baiting and this one is seeing to the baiting. Now, if it has this ability, the big, good competitor pig, if it has the ability to take the visual perspective, we would predict it follows this one and not that one. So after the baiting, the experimenter goes out and the barriers are removed. The two little ones are released. They run into their respective corridors that they've been trained to go into. And this one then is released, and the question is, which one does it follow? And this is what happened. Of the 10 pigs we had trained, only one pig, actually, we could only test one pig because some of the others had positional biases, so that would always run to the left, or always run to the left. They didn't have enough test replicates for us to test statistically, or they just didn't follow the companions. They didn't bother. So we had one pig reaching the criterion we needed for testing, and that did follow the seeing companion more, as we had predicted. Our conclusion have to be slightly tempered. So this one pig, its responses were consistent with visual perspective taking, but we cannot rule out completely that it had learned before we even started the training. That's, if you have a barrier in front of you, you can't see, and it's no point then paying that pig any attention. So we didn't full out conclude anything about visual perspective taking in a big way, but we had this one pig consistent with our predictions. Sort of a stronger vein of research has been the informed forager paradigm for us, and we didn't invent that, we just used it for pigs. And the simple idea of that is, again, you have a group of animals foraging together, and it was first done with primates. So you have a group together, and only one member of the group knows where the food is. So you have one group member with privileged information about the food location. We call that the informed animal. And then you let them all go together to find the food. And you look at the interactions between the informed individual and the rest of the group to see how they, how much they understand about what the other is doing, or maybe even what the other is intending. And we did it like this. So we had our mini group. So we had 8 pairs of pigs, again, one larger one and one smaller one, with the larger one being the one that would compete successfully for food if they only had one bucket, so the larger one would get it. And we had this arena, and so we had 8 buckets in here, sort of hidden in corners of these mounts. So, and they were hidden in the distal corner, so we had one bucket here, one there, and one there, one there, one there, and then one there and one there. And the pig first individually come in here through this flap again, so start flap, and they forage for the food. And they know that there is food in one bucket. And monopolizable, again, means that only one pig can get the food because the bucket is just big enough for one head. And if you've got a larger pig and a smaller pig, and it's usually the larger pig being stronger that is dominant in this context. So we have a difference. Then we have a difference in competitive ability when the two pigs forage together, and we make it such that the subordinate animal, the smaller animal, is informed. So we give it privileged information about where the food is when they go in together. And the way we do this is the littler pigs, the informed pigs, they have a first visit in training. They go in, they look for the food in all the 8 buckets, they find the food, they come out again for a retention interval of a few minutes, get returned back into the arena, and the food's again in the same bucket than it was in the sample visit. So it's a spatial memory task. Goes in, finds the food, comes out, goes around again, and the food's again in the same bucket. So it basically learns a spatial memory task, and they're quite quick at learning that. The other one, the big one, goes in by itself as well during training, and only ever has sample visits. So she only ever goes in, and the bucket is randomly in one of the food is randomly in one of the bucket. So the larger non-informed pigs, they learn, they go in, and the food's somewhere in one of the 8 buckets. And what we do for testing then is still the informed pig, the little ones, they do their sample visit. So when they go in the second time, they know where the food is. But the larger pigs now get paired for their sample visit during the recall visit. So when they go in together, the informed pigs know where the food is and the other one doesn't. And this is what we found. So the dominant pigs, the large one, they abandon searching for themselves in these pair trials. So they learn that it's more efficient for them to go and follow because they get exploited. So they start following the subordinates to the food source and then displace them. And the measure we had of that was how many buckets the dominants visited. And by doing so by following and then getting the food, the dominants dramatically increased their foraging efficiency as measured by the number of buckets visited before the food was found. The real interest in this is what the subordinates do. How do they respond to this exploitation over continued trials? And the reason why this is of such interest is because it's been used, the behavior of the subordinates has been used again to say something about higher cognitive abilities in animals. So people have suggested that the behavior of the subordinates is, can be used to look for deception, so intentional misleading of the following dominant animal to get an advantage. So, and even manipulating, understanding the beliefs of others, of the co-forager, or is it about understanding what the behavior of the other pig? So the way we did it is we looked at the foraging choices of the subordinate, and it's basically a logistic, or I framed it as a logistic regression problem. So whether the foraging choices of the subordinate are dependent on the dominant doing one thing rather than another. So the way that I can phrase it, you can phrase it as a logistic regression problem, is that you ask, does the behavior or the position of the dominant change the probability of the subordinate doing one thing rather than another? Because it's a binary outcome. So we have two binary outcomes looking at the behavior of the subordinate pigs when they change direction or when they do a bucket visit. And the bucket visit can be a binary outcome either to a baited bucket or unbaited bucket. Same with the change in direction. The change in direction, we define it by a sort of certain angle, can be away from where the food is or towards where the food is. And the question was, is it more likely they do this depending on certain things that the dominant pig does? So are the going towards the food choices of the subordinate, are they dependent on what the dominant pig does? So we looked at the dominant's behavior at these decision points, or these two decision points for the subordinate. And this is what we found. So the subordinates were more likely to move away from the baited bucket or visit an unbaited bucket, so not go to the food, when the dominants were nearer to the baited bucket, they themselves, when the dominants were close, as defined by being one pig length away, when the dominants were moving towards the baited bucket themselves rather than away from it, and the dominants were in view of the subordinates rather than being out of view. So the subordinates were more likely to show food-directed behavior when the chances of arriving at the food source ahead of the dominants were increased. So they flexibly adapted their foraging choices to the behavior of the co-foraging scroungers. So there was some flexible responding. And they used these strategies when they're repeatedly foraging with the same scrounger. So it's something that developed over time. And of course, for these animals, they're in a producer-scrounger situation, and for them, emigration isn't an option. So what we're suggesting is it's a sensible strategy when you cannot leave the group. Okay. Question was whether this is, in any sense, a successful deceptive tactics. In our case, not at all, because there was no advantage to the subordinates doing what they did. So to delay going to the baited bucket when the dominants were nearby. So there was no evidence for a foraging advantage when those tactics were used. And there was no history of increased foraging success. So foraging success, for example, we could measure by how much time did they have at the baited bucket before the other animal got there and displaced it. And that just was, even when they deployed these tactics, there was no statistical difference. So no discernible success. So then we need to think about why did they do it? And they did it because what happened is if they went straight to the food and the other one, the dominant animal, followed them, they got displaced, which is aversive to them. So they got conditioned, they learned when not to approach the food rather than when to go to the food. So with displacement acting as a negative enforcer, conditioning these behaviors. So taken together, how far have we got with this so far? So the domestic, they developed behavioral tactics to avoid displacement. And what we can say in terms of their cognitive abilities is clearly they understand complex contingency involving the behavior of others. So if I do this, the pig does that, then this happens to me. Yeah. We push this a bit further because as we had it before, the animals didn't really have that much of an opportunity to get away from the dominance. So the way we did it this time is we had 2 food sites, so we still had the same number of buckets, but we baited 2 buckets, one with a little bit of food in and one with a lot of food in. So we had a small bait and a large bait. So that allowed us to make clearer predictions for misleading. And of course, our prediction was the subordinate pig is being followed and will lose the food to the dominant animal. So what it should do is go to the small bait first. That would be, adaptive strategy, sensible thing to do. Go to the small bait first, park the dominant animal there, and then rush to the larger food bait. And we knew from previous experiment that they can discriminate. They will prioritize. If they have limited amount of time, they will prioritize going to a large food. So we know they can discriminate between two amounts of food. The other thing we did, again, to make our predictions clear, is we had 2 types of co-forager, so a larger and a smaller one. No, not a large and smaller. We had 2 large co-foragers, but one that would always follow, as in the previous one, and one would never follow, because the other one, the non-following one, would always go to the same bucket. So it had no interest in following the subordinate animal. So the related question was whether pigs can discriminate between different types of co-forager. So we had these different tests. So we had the informed pig with the non-informed following pig, like we had before. Again, we had the informed pig little with a dominant pig, but not following, because in the non-following pigs always went to the same bucket. So for them, there was no point in following the informed. And then we had individual control, so when the I-pigs went into lone. And our predictions were these. So if they can mislead, they should retrieve the small bait first when they're with the followers. They might retrieve the large bait first or have no preference when they are with the non-followers. And when they're by themselves, again, they should retrieve the large bait first or show no preference. And this is what we got. So this is the key one that we're really interested in. So when they're with the following dominance, and we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7 pigs. And these are just the numbers, the raw numbers. So pig 1, for example, went to the large bait first, and then the small one, and so on. So there is no clear preference to going to the small one first. So the total number of tests are here. So there's no evidence that the I-pigs, the subordinate, retrieved the small bait first when paired with exploiting dominance. Now, when they were with the non-followers, and here they did go to the large bait first. So most of them have a preference for going to the large bait first. And then again, with the individual controls, similarly, if you look at the top row, most of them went to the large bait, more often went to the large bait first. Okay, so in summary, so when they're not with the scrounging co-foragers, the test pig retrieved the large bait before the small one, and this bias disappeared in the presence of an exploitative competitor. But against prediction, test pigs did not switch to retrieving the smaller bait when with the exploiter. So the question is, what do they do instead? And what they do instead, they just go faster. So you open the flap, and we knew that. So we looked at the videos again, and we just looked at the speed with which they enter. So when they're with a follower, the one that they know is going to follow them, exploit them, they dash in very quickly. So they clear the first 3 of the squares really quickly, and they also get to the first bait really quickly. So they just try and get an advantage that way. Whereas when they're with a non-following dominant, they just go slower. Okay. So they have a non-deceptive speed-up strategy when foraging with a scrounging dominant. And what it does show is that they can tell one co-forager apart from the other. So they discriminate between different co-foragers. Okay. So Pigs understand complex social contingency involving the behavior of others and discriminate depending on who they're with. Okay, so this is a bit of a gallop for that. Now, the other aspect of what I was going to talk about is how we may get an operational handle on measuring effect. And it's just to remind ourselves that Mike Mendel and his partner Liz Poole, they came up with this conceptual framework for affective states having two discrete dimensions, valence and arousal. And they've come up with a way of getting a handle on valence, what valence state, affective state the animal is in. So we know in humans, affect reliably influences cognition. So and it's the glass is half empty or half full syndrome. So we know that happy people judge ambiguous stimuli positively compared to unhappy people. And if emotion induces cognitive biases, so optimistic or pessimistic decision-making in ambiguous situations exists in other species, they could provide a valuable new indicator of animal emotion. So if animals did the same as humans do, judge ambiguous stimuli depending on their background affective state, we may be able to use that to get a handle on it. And such cognitive biases are likely to occur across species if they have adaptive value, which I was trying to get going in the beginning, trying to explain how affect and cognition work hand in hand to influence behavioral responses. So in the theoretical take on the theoretical background is here's suggested adaptive value is. So say, so this is sort of the affective state an animal or a human finds himself or herself in, so ranging from being in a very, very negative state to very positive state. And what happens to you and when you're there affects how you predict future events will happen. So say you're here, then over time something bad happens to you, you have this harmful or threatening event, which pushes the animal further into sort of a negatively valent state, further into a negatively valent state. You may get a positive experience here that pushes your valent state up, the affective state up a bit. The question is, what is your expectation at this point when you meet an ambiguous stimulus? So, for example, you hear a rustle. Will you think that's a mate that you should approach because it will increase your fitness by doing so, because you pass on more of your genes? Or is it a predator, which will not affect your fitness positively? So it's the stimulus is ambiguous, and the question is, how do you judge it? Do you approach it or do you avoid it? And the prediction is that if you're in a negative state, you will think it's a threatening stimulus. So negative mood states reflect a cumulative experience of threat, harm, guides, and pessimistic decisions under ambiguity. And then the reverse would be true for being in a already positively valent state. And the point being that we need non-linguistic measures to explore whether cognitive biases can reflect emotional state in animals, and this is what they've come up with, Liz and Mike between them. So they've come up with a test, basically by pairing one kind of stimulus with a reward and another kind of stimulus with a punishment or a lack of reward. So say a positive tone and a negative tone. And the animal has to perform different responses to get the food in response to the positive tone, or to perform another operant response to avoid getting the negative tone and avoid a noise. And performing a response P indicates anticipation of a positive event, and performing N, so performing that indicates anticipation of a negative event. So if when you play an ambiguous tone in the middle, if the animal responds to these tones with N, it means it expects something negative will happen. If it responds here with a positive response, with this conditional response, it means it expects something positive will happen. And the hypothesis to be tested, of course, is the happier animals are more happier animals generally, but this was done with rats, are more likely to respond to probes by performing response P, and more negatively valent things will respond with N. So the test then is you try and make the animal, you try and house them such that their predicted state is either positive or negative. So rats, you can house the rats either in unpredictable conditions, sort of presumably inducing a more negative mood, or in stable and predictable conditions, which presumably puts them into more positive mood. And then you just test them in this paradigm. And lo and behold, rats in unpredictable housing conditions were more likely to treat the probe tones, so these ambiguous in the middle tones, as negative. So they were more likely to do the N response. This has been further developed quite a lot. So there's also now a spatial task. So where rather than playing tones, there are just two locations. So there's a positive, so like say a big food reward, and a little food reward. And again, you test the animal, and then also ambiguous, so as in the middle, intermediate locations. And you just see after you've conditioned the positive and the negative, you'll just see which one the animal will approach, depending again on their background mood state, which you've tried to induce with different housing conditions. And so this works. So here's an intermediate, one of the intermediate location. So this would be the negative, unrewarded location. This is the positive location. And what we're looking at is how fast the animals approach it. And the ones, and we have unenriched and enriched background housing conditions, and the unenriched animals, they run more slow. They approach. They assume that an ambiguous tone, so the nearest unrewarded, will be negative and unrewarded rather than positive. Really nicely, and also quite new. So this paper only came out this year, but really nicely, this finding generalizes across other taxa, not just mammals. So a lot of work has been also done in cognitive bias, judgment bias in birds, and then also in invertebrates, so bees, and most recently Drosophila. Okay, and this is my last slide. I just want to show you one of the experiment that's done with pigs, where this has been used. This same judgment bias task has been used to look at. It's really, if you like, a neurotransmitter validation. So it's looking at whether the lack of serotonin affects the behavior of these animals in a judgment bias task. And the judgment bias task used was this one. It's a spatial task, and it was parachlorophenylalanine was used to deplete the saline. So on the y-axis again, you have the relative latency, so how quickly the animals move, and this is would be the middle probe, so the most ambiguous tone, and the dark bars are how quickly they moved when their serotonin is really low, so after they've had PCPA. And the gray bars are how quickly they move to the intermediate tones when they, without serotonin depletion. And this is what we want to look at. So this is how quickly they moved to this ambiguous stimulus. And if you just look at the dark bar, so the line shows when the PCPA was given. So this is the point of depletion. So these are controls before, and this is after. And there's a large difference in latency without serotonin and with normal serotonin. So serotonin depletion, the idea is that makes the animals react more pessimistically or choose more pessimistically in this judgment bias task. Okay, thank you very much. I think that was my last slide. Thanks.
sessions after all the presentations.
Thank you, Suzanne, for sharing your research with us. My name is Riana Topan. I'm with Humane Society International in Canada. Some of you might have heard of us before, but just in case you haven't, we're an animal protection organization that works in many different countries, and our goal is to confront cruelty to animals wherever it happens. So for all different kinds of animals, whether it's wildlife or companion animals or farm animals. So I work specifically on campaigning for better welfare and practices for farmed animals. And what I'm here to talk to you about today is the ways that pigs are treated in our factory farming system. So I think, a lot of us tend to assume that the animals within our farming system are probably not treated great, but they're probably not treated horribly either. I think that's something that we tend to tell ourselves because it makes it easier for us to maintain the status quo and continue to eat and live the way that we do. But I do want to shed some light into how the system works and some of the really horrific practices that actually do exist and are perfectly legal. And I'll just mention too that there are some images and a video at the end that is could be disturbing to some viewers. It's a little bit graphic, so if you do need to step out, I'll give you a warning before the video. It's a few minutes long, but I do hope that you can stay through it. So when we talk about pigs, I think it's important for you to keep in mind just how many animals we're talking about. So within Canada last year in 2017, we killed over 21 million pigs for food. And that's a huge number. I know it can be hard to sort of get your head around that. But when we think about our population of our country, it's 36 million people. This is not really that far below that. And we killed more animals, just pigs, or we killed close to that many number of pigs in 2017 for food. And then over 1 million of those animals are breeding sows. And so those, as you can imagine, are female pigs that are used specifically for breeding in the pork industry. And I want you to keep that number in mind because Suzanne mentioned in her presentation, that these breeding sows used to be kept in individual stalls, but that's no longer legal. That's the case in certain countries like Europe. That is not the case in Canada. We are moving away from these stalls is the plan, but that's several years into the future, and it won't be complete ban. It will just be that you can't keep them in these stalls for life. But the current practice is that a breeding sow is basically used for breeding in the pork industry, and they are repeatedly impregnated over the course of their lives. And each time they're impregnated, they are kept in a crate like this. It's called the Gestation Crate, and it's supposed to keep them safe. But in reality, as you can see, these crates are so small that these animals can't even move around. They can't engage in any of their natural behaviors. They can't socialize like they would like to in the wild, as we learned earlier. They are very social creatures. And it's a very miserable, very sad, very boring, very tedious existence. And so what's common is because in the wild, pigs would have something to do. They'd have an area to forage in. They'd have people or animals to socialize with. They'd have areas to explore. They could move around freely. Because they don't have any of that in these gestation crates, they end up often chewing on the bars where they're held. And as you can see, they will chew sometimes so much that they start to bleed, but they have nothing else to do all day. So I guess it's better than being completely bored and just standing there with nothing to do for hours and hours and months on end. You can also see they'll develop things like sores and infections and wounds because they might, cut themselves on a protruding part of the metal that they're kept in, and they won't always receive the medical or veterinary care that they need. And just so you know, the last picture in this photo here, which I think really speaks to how miserable these pigs have it, and these gestation crates, you can see this pig looks very defeated. These photos were taken a few years ago at a farm in Virginia in the States, which actually is owned by a supplier to Smithfield. And Smithfield's is the third largest pork producer in the world. So I think that speaks to the fact that this is a very common practice in the industry. And this photo here, I wanted to show it for two reasons. First of all, it is from Canada. So it was taken by Mercy for Animals, which is another animal protection organization from a facility in Manitoba. And also, I think you can see a lot of expression in that pig's eyes, right? It's clearly there's a personality there and there's a lot of fear there. And similarly, this is another photo from that same facility. So just evidence again that, just because the earlier photos were from the States, the same thing happens here in Canada. So there's the gestation crate, which is one major issue in terms of the way that we treat these animals. This is another issue. It's called a farrowing crate. And so after the breeding sows give birth, they are moved to a different sort of crate where they can nurse their piglets, but again, in a confined system that prevents them from being able to move around freely, being able to exercise, explore, fully being able to socialize with their young. And again, this is standard practice in the industry. Another thing that you probably don't know about is castration. So piglets at a very young age, usually before they even reach 10 days of age, are castrated without adequate pain control. It basically looks just like this. They'll be restrained by, a handler, a farmer, whatnot, who will cut into their testicles with a blade or scalpel, rip them out, and then spray them with some sort of disinfectant and let them go on their way. So there's a lot of evidence that this is very painful and stressful for them. We see their heart rates elevated. They vocalize a lot. They don't move around as much or as freely after the procedure's finished because they are in pain. And it's frustrating, especially, is that the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association has said that you should be providing anesthetics and analgesics for pain and sensation to prevent these piglets from being in pain and discomfort during this procedure, but it's not actually required. You're required to give them analgesics for a short period of time, but it's not sufficient to control the pain during this procedure and afterwards. And then there's something called tail docking. So, when we think of a pig, we usually think it has this long curly tail, and that's how it is in the wild. But because these pigs are kept in such crowded facilities where they have nothing to do all day, this is, just in the meat industry, not even for the breeding sows, but for any pig, they tend to bite each other's tails because they have nothing better to do. And so as a mitigation measure, the industry will remove a large portion of their tails, again, without adequate pain control. And so as you can see, they're kept in very crowded conditions over the course of their lives. Again, there's nothing for them to do all day. They can socialize a little bit because they are kept in small groups, but clearly this is a far cry from what they would be experiencing if they were in the wild. And at the end of their lives, they reach market weight, slaughter weight at around 5 to 6 months. So it's a very, very unnaturally short life. They'll be loaded onto a transport truck and taken to slaughter. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the slaughter and the transport process, both of which are stressful and have their own horrors, but my Abby, who's here from the SAVE movement, will do a presentation after that, and we'll tell you a bit more about those processes. I did just want to mention, though, that something for you to keep in mind is that it's perfectly legal in Canada currently for you to transport a group of pigs or any pig for up to 36 hours continuously without a break or any rest, without any food or without any water. And importantly, that can happen in any sort of climate. There are no restrictions on the types of weather or climate in which you can transport an animal like a pig, and no requirements for you to provide protection from that. So I'm sure you're going to hear more about that in Abby's presentation. And then one other thing I wanted to mention too, and I mentioned it yesterday if you were here for the session about chickens, is that another surprisingly common occurrence and legal issue within Canada is that farms aren't required to have fire safety measures or plans like evacuation measures or fire drills or industrial grade smoke detectors or sprinkler systems. And that's because farms are considered to be low human occupancy buildings, and because we treat animals basically under the eyes of the law as property. And so what you'll see is a lot of headlines like this one, which was just less than a month ago, where 12,000 pigs, 12,000 innocent animals were killed in a barn fire near Rosetown, Saskatchewan. And we hear of things like this all the time. Sometimes it gets media coverage, sometimes it doesn't. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like this is anywhere close to being changed because our laws continue to lag behind the idea that, animals are sentient and they do deserve protection. So I'm about to wrap up. I do have my next slide is the start of the video. So just again, a warning that if you do need to step out, please do what you need to do. But otherwise, I'll let this run for about 4 minutes. Oh, and this is taken by Mercy for Animals.
supplies pork to Walmart, Sobeys, Superstore, Loblaws, and Metro. Thousands of pregnant pigs are confined to filthy gestation crates so small they are unable to even turn around or lie down comfortably for their entire lives. Driven mad from stress and boredom, these naturally curious and social animals have nothing to do, day after day, hour after hour, but to bite the bars of their cages out of desperation. This intensive confinement causes many pigs to suffer from large, open wounds and pressure sores. Here, a pig has broken her neck and died while tangled between the bars of her narrow gestation crate. This mother pig, physically taxed from constant birthing, suffers from a distended, inflamed, and bleeding prolapse. Sick pigs are kicked, slapped, and pulled by their ears to force them into another room where they are killed. Some were still conscious and blinking even after having a metal bolt fired into their skulls. Dead bodies are a common sight at this pork supplier. Rampant filth at the factory farm attracts maggots. Piglets endure extreme pain when workers rip out their testicles. Slice off their tails without any painkillers. Baby piglets who are sick or aren't growing fast enough have their heads smashed against metal poles or concrete and are left to die a slow death. Most of the 21 million pigs killed for food in Canada each year are born to pigs in gestation crates like these, which are considered so inhumane they've been banned by the entire European Union, Australia and New Zealand, as well as 9 US states. Sobeys, Metro, Superstore, Loblaws, and Walmart condone this atrocious cruelty to animals by buying pork from factory farms that cram pigs into gestation crates. Please call on these retailers to make it their policy not to buy pork from suppliers who use gestation crates. The greatest power all Canadian consumers have to help end the inherent widespread cruelty of the Canadian factory farming system is to choose a vegetarian diet. Visit pigcruelty.ca to learn more.
Thank you for sitting through that. No matter how many times I watch it, it's still extremely difficult. As I mentioned, that was a video taken by Mercy for Animals, which is another animal protection organization that does a lot of undercover work. And this video is a few years old, but still very relevant. The practices haven't changed in the last few years. The good news, if there is any, is that we are moving away from the gestation crate system, as I mentioned. So as a result of things like this, footage that really allowed consumers to understand where their food is coming from, there was a lot of outrage from the Canadian public, and now all of the major retailers, grocery retailers in Canada, and many of the fast food chains and whatnot have said that in the next few years, they're going to eliminate the use of, or the continuous lifelong use of gestation crates in their supply chains. So it does give me hope that things can change when consumers speak out and when people really realize where their food is coming from. Oh yeah, there's just a couple more slides. So just in terms of what you can do, I mean, obviously we all have the power to make purchasing decisions that are in line with our values, and there's lots of great alternatives to pork products out there right now if you decide that you don't want to participate in the system. So, one thing that we advocate for in terms of what you can do is the 3 R's. So reducing your consumption of these products, replacing them with alternatives that don't harm animals, or refining your selection so that if you do choose to continue choosing pork products, for example, you at least buy them from higher welfare sources that don't use some of the practices that we just saw in the video. And then I encourage you all to do what you're doing today, to learn as much as you can about the food system and the animals that are within it, and how intelligent and social and emotional they are, and the way that we actually treat them. Share what you learn, discuss what you learn, write about it, whatnot. You can always get involved with organizations like ours. And I always encourage people to vote their conscience. So, vote for politicians and political parties that have a platform on animal welfare and actually care about this as an issue. And also to talk to your elected representatives about this as an issue, right? I mean, they don't always know what's happening either, and they don't know that this is an important issue to their constituents, but it's worth raising with them. And then finally, we have seen, as I mentioned with the issue of the gestation crates, that if you do make your concerns heard to the companies that have a lot of buying power in our market, that are the big purchasers of products that come from our factory farming systems, they will push for changes if they believe it's important to their consumers. So that is a way that we can all have an impact. And I'll just leave you with my email address, but I will also be available for questions during the panel. Thank you.
Sorry. It's okay, I can project. Well, tell us what it feels like to be a pig.
Yeah, not that I'm like a Dr. Dolittle type or anything like that, but I do spend a lot of time with animals. So just to give you an idea of who I am, my name's Abby, and I work with the Save movement, predominantly in Ontario, but I've been all across Canada bearing witness at different slaughterhouses, farms, auction houses. So we get to see what life is like for these animals in the reality of the practices that are happening in Canada here today. So I just do want to give you a little bit of a warning. What you're about to see is all Canadian content, but it is sometimes uncomfortable to watch. If you were a part of the talk yesterday, you saw a little bit of, the kind of content I'm going to display here, and it's similar just with pigs today. Basically, why we put this stuff out on social media is because we want people to see what's really happening, and we want them to make the connection between the mass number of animals that we slaughter every year and the individuals that those experiences are actually happening to. Good. So this, if any of you have heard about the Save movement before, you've probably heard about Toronto Pig Save. That's where the whole kind of idea was founded. This is at Fearman's Pork in Burlington. It's one of the larger slaughterhouses in the area. 10,000 pigs are killed here every day. The pigs that come here are all 4 to 6 months old at the time of slaughter, and they can be in transit, as mentioned, for up to 36 hours. So when we see them arriving in the middle of winter, in the dead of summer heat, there can be some extreme instances of animal suffering happening on these trucks. But again, it's really hard to conceptualize the individuals when we can just see like a truck passing by, which is why we ask people to come closer and really look these animals in the eye and make the connection. They're very intelligent. They're one of the top, I think, in the top 5 intelligent animals in the world. Very on par with dogs. They're very social. They're very curious. They have personalities all their own. People often think that they're dumb and stinky and that they don't, have a lot of personality, but they do. So I'm just going to show you a little video of just one moment. It's not particularly graphic or any in one way or another. This is just one moment at Fearman's Pork bearing witness. So when the trucks come off the highway, we're here on the median, and we just kind of, while they're stopped at the red light, we approach the trucks and bear witness. And this is just a few moments with a few animals and activists. So that was filmed this past winter. It was an incredibly cold day. It was only about minus 10 degrees Celsius. But even so, us having our hands exposed was very painful for more than 2 minutes at a time. So pigs having similar skin to ours, we can only assume that it was very painful for them to be traveling down the highway at 100 kilometers an hour for 36 hours in these temperatures. A lot of what we see, the extreme conditions, is frostbite, different overheating, panting, foaming at the mouth in the heat, often vomiting. They're always thirsty. They're not allowed food, water, or rest during these journeys, so they are desperate for water, especially in the summer. We will bring bottles of water and give it to them if they want. Common injuries are scrapes and scars from overcrowding with other pigs, prolapse, ear biting. That thing is very common. The scratches, because they're kept in these conditions and in transit for so long, the pigs will act aggressively toward each other. But when they're in their natural environment, when they're given space to move away from an aggressive pig, for example, these kind of instances aren't nearly as common. And yes, stressed and panicked animals, they often will huddle together or hide their faces under each other if they're afraid. They're very curious of some of us, just like, humans, some are more social than others. This is an example of the scarring that we see all the time. In every single truck, there's a dozen or so pigs that have extreme cases like this. Sometimes they're open wounds. Sometimes you can tell they're a little bit older, but it's very, very common. An example of the ear biting. Some of them, again, will be in worse conditions than others, but this one looks like it had been repetitive. In the heat, that's when pigs suffer the most. They are unable to sweat. In nature, they would be rolling around in mud piles to cool their bodies down, but obviously in the environments we've given them, they don't have that ability. So this is actually just from a few weeks ago. At Fearman's again, we had an extreme heat wave, kind of similar to the way that we're having it now, where it was upwards of 30, 35 degrees and feeling like 40 degrees with the heat and humidity. So these animals were suffering in extreme conditions, and this is a particularly powerful clip. So as you can see, the panting was very excessive. And if any of you heard a couple years ago, Anita, the founder of the Toronto Pig Save and founder of the Save movement, was actually charged for giving water to a thirsty pig. We've been continuing the practice since she was charged and much long after, but it's very obvious to anyone who goes and bears witness in the extreme heat that these animals are desperate for water. we often see blood splatter on the trucks just from wounds that the pigs have, and when they're traveling down the highway, the blood splatters along the side. This is an image that was taken at a farm, actually, but it kind of just goes to show how these animals are disregarded and not seen as worthy of life. If they have no or little value to the farmer, if they cannot profit from their slaughter, they will just be shot in the head, as we saw earlier. And then they get dumped into these bins and picked up to be sent to a rendering plant to be used for dog food and a bunch of other different things. These animals, these ones who are sick or injured, they're never given an opportunity to live out a natural life. They're never given a chance to go to a sanctuary or find a real home. There's only one way out of this kind of industry, and that's death. So I do want to talk about one instance that happened a couple years ago that really, I think it just brought to light the way that we treat animals. And some of you might have heard it if you're in the vegan community, but on October 5th in 2016, a transport truck full of these pigs coming to Burlington flipped over right at the intersection in which we actually bear witness. And so activists were on the scene within a few minutes. Most of the animals were able to be walked into the slaughterhouse because they didn't have extreme injuries, but 40 of the animals did die immediately in the crash. Firemen were on site to get them out of the truck, and then the slaughterhouse employees walked them with paddles and prods and cardboard into the kill floor. But any pig that was injured was then deemed unfit for human consumption, and so was killed and discarded anyway. These are just a couple of the photos from that day. You can see some of the animals there being ushered through the parking lot of the slaughterhouse. The one photo of a dead pig there is just one who had died in the crash, and then them being offloaded as well. There was well over 100 activists there during the time, and we had a sanctuary ready to take the animals. There was some survivors that could have possibly lived out a happy life, but the slaughterhouse denied any mercy for them. It's mostly an audio clip, but it's a clip from a live stream video that one of the Toronto Pig Save organizers, Lori, she was one of the first people on the scene that day and was able to actually get in there before they had put tarps up because they didn't want the public to see. So they had literally brought in ladders and put tarps up so we couldn't film or do anything. But this is just a clip so you can hear the animals in pain inside the truck. They're suffering from a bunch of injuries, and even when they're getting them off the truck, they still use paddles and prods to move the injured animals. So as you can hear, like those animals were clearly in distress. It was a horrific sound. Even that clip doesn't really do it justice, the amount of pain that you could hear for miles around. These two, this is the organizers named Bonnie and Clyde. They were two of the survivors, but they were unable to walk their way back to the slaughterhouse. So they eventually found a patch of grass, the only piece of grass that they had ever touched in their short lives. And they shared this tender moment, which became kind of like the takeaway from the whole accident, was just showing that even in all of this pain and all this stress, these animals still showed each other love and affection. And again, we had a sanctuary owner there the day begging to release one of the animals to his sanctuary, and he had a trailer ready to go, but it was not allowed. So to wrap up, basically, pigs are individuals. Many people think pigs are dirty and stinky and aggressive, but when given the chance to live a life free from harm and exploitation in a natural environment, they're social, friendly, quite clean. They're very intelligent, and just the fact that they are living and breathing, they are worthy of life just as any individual like we are. I like showing that clip because I feel like it's kind of a tender moment. It was a very quiet day, but that was my friend Jen's first time bearing witness, and obviously it's that individual pig's first time ever getting a moment of compassion from an animal or from a human. So it was kind of a interesting moment between them, how they shared that. And then let's just end with a happy pig, because they all deserve to be free and happy. This is a pig who is actually, she fell off a slaughterhouse truck a number of years ago and made her way to Cedar Row Farm Sanctuary in Ontario. And now she's clearly in a much happier space than she would have been. But yeah, that's basically my presentation on pigs, and I'm available for questions after with the panel as well. Thanks.
Would it be easiest if the three speakers came up to the front and then people could ask questions either collectively or to specific individuals? About how much time do we have, Steve? 30 minutes. To 9:30. So we have about 40 minutes. I think you blew everybody away. No one's lining up.
It's okay too.
Okay, so sorry, I got out of the room because, so I couldn't attend all of the presentation, but it wasn't because I was feeling sick, it was actually frustration because of not the graphic content in general, but, sorry, I just ran a little bit. Because of actually the humans, how they treat the animals and making fun of it. And this is why I was so frustrated and got out. But I was wondering about that. What about the human conditions, the human worker conditions in these places? Isn't it something that could be treated as a first easy step towards helping these pigs?
I can add a little or comment on that a bit anyway. I think it's definitely like an angle that we need to tackle. A lot of the activists that I work with are former employees of slaughterhouses or former truckers, so they know firsthand these kind of experiences, and they know the state that a lot of these people are working in. The Save Movement does have, well, actually there's a few, but there's a slaughterhouse support worker line that we try to encourage all the people to, or all the open, receptive workers that we engage with to go with, to call into, and then they are given access to, if they need a new job, there's people that they connect to and find work in their area. If they need counseling, we can get them in contact with people there, or if they just want to talk, because sometimes honestly all they want to do is talk. But these people are very much abused in the system as well. And I think really what's going to happen for full liberation is that we're going to be liberating the humans as well as the animals in these places of injustice.
Does that work? Yeah, okay. Yeah, again, like yesterday, I have the same question. Where are the federal veterinarians? Because I know that we have horrible practices in like keeping those animals, but the transport must be regulated somehow. And if animals die from heat strokes, that should not be, or frostbites, or
My understanding is that there's a number. I don't know what the number is, but every slaughterhouse has an acceptable number of dead on arrivals or injured animals, and that's just industry standard, and they don't really think twice of it. Also, a lot of the time when we're reporting these, like we'll take photos and videos like this and then send it in, the authorities don't really care. They'll say that's just business as usual. So unless like over 100 people report the same incident, it doesn't really get anything happening.
And just to add to that, I think a further complication from what I understand is that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which is supposed to have veterinarians that monitor these kinds of situations, they don't have enough staff. I think, again, because this isn't a priority, really. From everything I've heard, there aren't enough veterinarians to really go around and do the thorough inspections that they're supposed to do. And then you'll see some that I think just maybe don't take their job as seriously as they should. So another Mercy for Animals investigation, for example, captured, I think it was at another pig facility during transport, captured a CFIA investigator or a veterinarian saying on camera, "Oh, I hope no one has a camera watching this because it'll end up on the internet." You know, so there's some level of complicity among at least some of these veterinarians. I can't speak for all of them, but that this is okay.
And are they part of the slaughterhouse, the veterinarians?
So they're from the government. Sorry, to clarify. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is a federal government ministry that is, part of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada that is supposed to regulate food safety and animal welfare and that kind of thing. But what we seem to have is a stance from the government that it's okay for the industry to sort of regulate itself. So that's sort of the government's approach to all farmed animal care in the country is, the industry can sort of set its own practices in the exception of a few cases that are, mandated by federal law, and we'll just sort of let them do their thing, and we don't want to interfere.
That sounds very American. You should oppose that.
So there's no farm animal protection law or guidance
in Canada? So the way it works in Canada is there's two things that are governed by federal law. There's slaughter and transportation. And so there are regulations that say, okay, animals should be handled well, and then it's literally like that vague. It's like they should not be caused unavoidable suffering. What does that mean? And what is prohibited and what is allowed? It's very vague and very hard to enforce, which I think goes back to this idea that there's this expectation that it's okay for the industry to sort of like dictate what is permissible. And then you have transportation as well. It's very vague. And as we mentioned, like it's the law currently for pigs is 36 hours without food or water or rest. So clearly there's some gaps there. And then everything else for on-farm practices are governed by the industry. So we have something called the National Farm Animal Care Council in Canada, which is comprised of some industry, so some farmers and producers, and some retailers and restaurant owners and that kind of thing, who are those big purchasers of these products. And then you have one animal welfare organization that sits on it. And together they develop codes of practice, which are supposed to be adhered to by the industry, but they're not legally enforceable. So if you don't follow the code of practice, nothing really happens in terms of a legal consequence or fine or whatnot. And the auditing and the compliance regulation and inspections happen by the industry themselves. So it's a very, very much a hands-off from a government approach. It's a good question.
So sorry, does that mean no legal prosecutions can be brought for animal cruelty on farms?
It depends. So sometimes you do see ramifications. Like, so in the instance of transport, there's been several issues with Maple Lodge farms with large shipments of birds arriving dead, frozen in the transport trucks before they even arrive at a slaughterhouse. And so Maple Lodge Farms, for example, has been fined, I think, twice for animal cruelty. And so there are some instances like that, but because most of the law is related to how an animal is treated on a farm or during its life, there's no legal requirement, and so there can't really be legal prosecution. In some extreme cases, you'll see, like in BC, there's been some undercover investigations, and now we're looking at fines and that kind of thing, but it's not the norm. It's quite rare. Do you have anything to add?
No, yeah, you got it. Okay.
Hi, I'm a veterinarian from Montreal. I've spent my life with cats and dogs. I realize those things happen. It's awful. But I'm afraid that it's the God of gold that is speaking what we have seen. To be competitive on the world market, because it's one price for the pound of pig or calf or chicken or milk or whatever. It's always the price. So are you willing to pay, instead of 99 cents for your Big Mac, $3? That's where the problem is. It's only money. And it's money everywhere, not only with animals, with people also. So whenever people are ready to pay the right price for a pound of meat, which is worth at least 3 or 4 times the price that we are paying now, you can't change this because you're acting at the wrong end of the chain. When you try to save a pig like this, it costs 100 times the price that we could work by paying the right amount of money for the right product. But people are not ready to do that. Just for fun, I live in the country. So I've started a pig farm. I raise 20 pigs per year. And I have difficulty selling it at my cost, and probably even less than my cost. People are not really ready to do something today, now, to change that. I'm very sorry to deceive your bubble, but
No.
it's only a bubble.
I guess my answer kind of to that would be that I wouldn't pay any amount of money, whether an obscenely large or an obscenely small amount of money for a piece of pig flesh, because it's not necessary for us to be doing it. It's not necessary for us to be doing it in the best, most humane possible circumstances. And so when we show people images like this, they're more inspired to actually take action and make change, and on a consumer level and on a political level and on a personal level that avoids animal cruelty in their entire lives. So while the people might not be ready to pay more money for a different way of killing an animal,
A happy pig.
A happy pig is a pig who gets to live out their lives as an individual.
But, I mean, like you said, there's 21 million pigs being eaten per year. How can you change that? I mean, that's the will of the people, the majority.
I think events like this are really important because it's really when people start to understand what actually happens behind the scenes in factory farming systems. It's until you have that education, people don't really understand. There's this idea, I think I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, we tend to assume that these animals are treated okay because we don't like the idea of anything else, but it's that education piece, and once people start to realize the true horrors that happen, that's when you start to see change. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think we're in it for the long haul.
What I've seen here, I think at least 90% of the Canadian knows about that. And
that's
in
not
Quebec,
true.
In Quebec,
every
they
day
have
I get
very
comments from
strict,
people who
they
say,
have
I've never
very
heard of this
strict
before.
For transportation, for the past, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, there have been very strict rules applied to transportation of animals, extremely, and with fine, very expensive fine. Of course, you can see things like this, but have you thought about the boat people in the Mediterranean, the Libyan, 9 million people?
What has that got to do with this?
Have left the country. What do you want to do about that?
Can we move on and get to another question, please?
Okay, I have a question about what is the status of CCTV movements in Canada? And Suzanne, could you say how it's going in the UK?
It's in abattoirs. It's not a legal requirement, but it's being looked into, and people are looking at whether it would make a difference to slaughterman behaviour. But there's no legal requirement at the minute. So I happen to know that in our research group, there's somebody looking at that, looking at whether CCTV, having the cameras there, would make a difference to slaughterman behaviour, but it's not legal requirement.
What do you mean looking at if it would make a difference?
Pardon?
What do you mean whether knowing that there are cameras would change the behavior? Well, that's one possibility. The other thing is that it would sensitize people to what's going on in the slaughterhouses.
Yeah. We have similarly a sort of undercover people, who expose really horrible practice every now and again. Same as you.
I have a second question, which it's sort of rhetorical. I think probably for somewhat racist reasons, people immediately talk about ritual slaughter, but I have difficulty seeing how anything could be much more horrible than what you've already shown us in non-ritual slaughter. But that's just a comment.
Thank you. Yes.
So, do you want to move a bit closer to the mic, right?
Okay. So one one of the comments has to do with, it really struck me how when Abby, your friend Jennifer, was going to be compassionate to that pig, and it occurred to me that those pigs have been so mistreated by humans, and yet they could still stand there and take the compassion from the humans. It wasn't a low animal response to be afraid the way other species would. So that was one thing I was really thunderstruck by. Another thing is we think about animals and it makes it okay if they're not intelligent. And then I was thinking about how the first speaker was talking about how the pigs are evolving and all the species are evolving. And it occurs to me that even the non-intelligent ones probably will become intelligent. It doesn't really make a difference. It's all life in its evolutionary grandeur, really. And the other thing is, when they were talking about being afraid of being filmed, to me that says it's the thing to do, that they know that there's going to be a response. So somehow getting this out is going to make the changes. And the last thing, when we see a truck going by on the highway and it's just so painful to watch, anything we can do, what can we do?
So just as like in the moment, what can you do? Is that kind of what you're asking? Because the very simple thing to do, sometimes to the driver, what I'll do is if I'm driving on the highway, I'll just stick my hand out the window and give him a peace sign. That way he knows that someone else is aware of what he's doing. And over time, sometimes those relationships blossom. At the slaughterhouse, someone will get out of their truck and be like, oh, I've been going vegetarian for 2 months now, and I know what you guys are doing. So these little seeds do kind of bloom over time. Sometimes what we do when a truck goes by and we can't actually bear witness, we just point so that the other people in the area are aware of what's happening and take another couple seconds to see what's really going on. Also, even just as simple as taking a photo of the truck, even if it's not inside to see the animals, just to take a photo and share that with online or with your friends and family and express the emotions that you felt and the conditions, just the whole experience can actually just start opening people up to it.
Thanks for all you do.
Thank you very much for everything. It was a nice presentation. I'm wondering, I have two questions. So I was earlier this week, yesterday, at a rescue, and I was with 2 pigs that escaped slaughter in Montreal. And they are still extremely young. They are about, I think they're 2 years old, something like that. And they're extremely depressed. And I'm wondering if it's a thing that has been worked on, or if you know anything about mental illness in animals, I guess, or in pigs. And then again, I'm wondering, what do we actually know about their cognition? Do we know anything about how they see the future or their own existence?
So to the first question, a couple of things. One is you can get something which is called learned helplessness. You may know about this. So it's when animals try and change or control their surroundings and they continuously fail. So then at some stage they give up. So that might explain it, or it could really be that they are just really sick and apathetic. Your second question was about sort of higher cognitive abilities. People have looked at whether pigs have a feeling for time, as in whether they can predict how long time intervals are, and there's a suggestion that they can. The ability to look into the future and know what might happen is, of course, really relevant to animal welfare. Also, for example, when you're in a slaughterhouse, or as a pig you're in a slaughterhouse, whether you can predict from the reactions of others what's going to happen. So they are all things that people like myself will look into.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I just can't figure out why how it is possible that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency aren't doing anything or aren't more strict about that kind of thing. And I was wondering, how much do you think there is collusion between meat industry and that kind of federal agency? And isn't possible to just try to expose that kind of thing? I can figure out how it could be possible that this is how it is without a lot of collusion between that kind of institution.
So I have a few thoughts about how this sort of happens and how it continues. And I think part of it is, we have a minister of agriculture, for example, who came from a farming background. And so that's his community. And of course, is he going to be inclined to, and not just him specifically, like all of the people who are, in senior positions, but are they going to be inclined to make laws and changes that make it harder for farmers to do their job as they currently do, or for them to, have more regulations and laws in place and that kind of thing. And I think we see a lot of reluctance from other government departments and from federal parties to mandate higher welfare practices or mandate, the end to certain really horrific things on these factory farms, because they know that they're going to alienate a large portion of their voters if they do that. And so my suspicion is that their fear and hesitancy is that they don't want to exclude large portions of the population because they want to be, put into power. And so what that ends up meaning is that it gets put on the back burner and it doesn't even get mentioned a lot of times in elections and political platforms and that kind of thing. And so I think, there's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of relationships involved. There's a lot of history there and a lot of reasons why people don't want the status quo to change, I suppose, in terms of government and politicians and whatnot. But I think if you asked any Canadian on the street, regardless of how you choose to eat or what decisions you make, do you want animals to suffer before they're killed? I don't think anyone would say yes to that. So there's a huge disconnect, I think, between what we see in the public perception and what we see with our regulations and our government. And I think it's going to take a long time, it looks like, for that to close. But the more vocal that we are and the more that we demand that our politicians do better and are more accountable to what we believe in our values and that kind of thing, I think we will start to see some change.
To add to that a little bit, but also I think a lot of the individuals, people don't always realize the amount of influence and the amount of power that you have, but even just as simple as sharing something on social media, like when you see that truck going by on the highway and you take the picture and you share your experience, you might have a circle of 100 friends or something, and guaranteed not every one of them is aware of what's happening. And so when you share that, you're at least planting the seed of compassion for someone else. I think it's going to take a lot of individuals, like all of us, working together to change the system. It's not like the system's going to change for us and that these people are going to automatically just be like, oh, we want to save all the animals and free them. No, it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen in an easy or smooth way, and it's not going to happen on one avenue. It's going to take everyone contributing to the change.
Hi, I think it's fascinating that we're here at a university, a place of higher level thinking, looking around. We're all grown-ups. I know I first learned about this type of thing as a 30-year-old. I wonder, we have a veterinarian, gave his life to helping animals, and in retirement, flip-flopped. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's fascinating that this information doesn't come out to the general population until we're adults. I'm Abby's husband. And I go to vigils with her from time to time, and we bring our kids from time to time, 8 and 10 years old. Other mothers bring their young children, and they get heat for it. There's police officers that will stop them and say, this is not the right thing to do as a parent. You need to shield your child from this. But in order to make informed decisions, we need information, and we need the right information, not skewed information, not information that might be collusion from the government. So my question is, how do we as activists, how do we as good people, how do we as people that come into an evening session to learn about the cognition of animals, how do we teach this to our children? What are we doing in schools? What are we shielding our own children from? And do you guys think that there's a line, or should we just be upfront and give them the information?
Thank you. Yes.
Was that a question?
Well, I think,
I thought he was just making a wonderful statement. I didn't know there was going to be an answer to it, but go right ahead.
As with anything, I think knowledge is power, and you treat. I've got 2 boys, and I treat them with respect, and I tell them, exactly how it is, and I try and make them be, mündig is a German word. I don't know what the English is for that, but it means you're a responsible adult capable of taking ethical decisions. That's all you can do, and you empower your kids with knowledge. I'm not really one for indoctrination, and I'm not dogmatic about anything in particular. So I'm not going to say, you should do this or that, or don't do this or that. I just hope that they will be mündige grown-ups and make their own decisions, ethical decisions.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's kind of like an injustice or a disservice to future generations to shield them from any truth that we know is happening right now, and that could be severe for not just their health, but the environment and the way that we evolve as a species. I think we need to be kind about it, but upfront about showing children the truth of what's happening, because then they can make better decisions in the future for us.
Absolutely. And I think it would be great to have some sort of component of this included in education, right, and into our schooling systems. I think that's hard, though, because there's a lot of ideas out there of things that we should be including in children's education, and we can't keep them in school 24 hours a day to teach them everything we'd like to. So I don't know how successful we'll be in that. It's something that I'd like to explore and plan to explore. But I think that, parents, for example, or people in the community who are concerned, they can do things like talk to the school administration about making sure that there's always plant-based food options in the cafeterias, or talk to the parent-teacher council about something that you can do to educate the students, or maybe try to organize an after-school workshop to see if you can get some kids out to that who can then become champions in the school and spread the message to students if you don't have that space to talk about it in more of like a formal educational component. So I encourage you to look for opportunities like that if that appeals to you.
It might turn out to be difficult for teachers actually to talk about this. Yeah. I can just give you an example. I was invited a few years ago to something at a elite high school for very intelligent students about animal research. It was supposed to be a neutral information, which of course it wasn't, because it was organized by an organization that was pro-animal research. And anyways, to cut it short, there was a plant-based biology teacher, and I talked to her, and she told me that when she educates the children where the eggs came from, some of the children didn't want to eat eggs anymore. And then some of the parents came after Easter and complained, my children don't want to eat eggs anymore. And you should say, oh, congratulations, you have amazing children. Yeah. But she got in trouble for it. Yeah. So that's how crazy it is. And in another anecdote, so I went to vet school and I had an interview before vet school, and it was really shocking actually, because there were two professors and one was for nutrition. And so we got into this huge debate about the mad cow disease and other things. And my argument was, why do you feed bone meal to herbivores? I mean, that's a sick idea. And his point was, you don't understand. It was just because the British reduced the temperature of for the burning of the carcasses, and that's why we had this problem. And then he started this discussion. We need cheap meat, and then he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you might have rich parents." And I'm like, "I might have rich parents, but I don't eat animals." So I was a little bit in shock about, like, I went to vet school to protect animals. That was my goal, and then I end up being interviewed by somebody who tells me we need to provide people with cheap meat, and I don't think so. I think this is like a vicious cycle. If veterinarians think we need to produce cheap meat, and if the industry thinks that, and of course the consumer might make price-based decisions because they don't know better, but I think this should not be on the market because it's just inhumane. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was more a statement than anything else. But
no, I agree. There's no humane way to kill someone who doesn't want to die. And animals, just like our companion pets back at home, cats and dogs, no one wants to go to their own death. None of us would give our lives for someone's pleasure or profit. And it's just an unnecessary practice.
And let's remember that it's not necessary for our health, on the contrary. Since there's a little bit of time left, I want to describe a proposal that some people here have already heard. And it's connected with the CCTV, but it's much more radical than what's not yet being done in the UK. And it's something that I think it's worth pressuring politicians and media for. It's a means of sensitizing people on a hypothesis. My hypothesis is that most people are not psychopaths. You would have to be a psychopath to know and see what's being done and not want to do something about it. So how to facilitate that? I mean, the witnessing, of course, is working for the few people that are looking and the few people that are seeing the stuff on internet. If CCTV, 24 hours a day, 360 degrees, were mandated at every site that animals are being used, from breeding right through to transport to slaughter, and if that CCTV footage were web streamed the way that this session is being web streamed, so that citizens, maybe beginning with activists, but eventually spreading to the rest of the population, can see what's allowed. It's fine. There are not enough inspectors to invigilate the rules that there are, which are completely ridiculously inadequate. But even for those inadequate rules, if citizen inspectors watch these web streamed and archived footage of all of this stuff, I think the cognitive dissonance, which we're not psychopaths, the cognitive dissonance that we all feel. I was a vegetarian for most of my life. I feel very guilty about that now. But while I was a vegetarian, I wasn't aware of this stuff. If we become aware of it and we want to do something about it, it doesn't mean that once you see this footage, you're going to stop eating meat. But there might be something that you might be favorable to, which is a second legislation over and above web-streamed CCTV, which is a graduated tax on all animal products, starting very small. And all of the money that's made from the tax is given as a rebate for the tax is put on all producers, vendors, and clients for animal products. If the proceeds from that tax were used to provide a rebate for producing, selling, and buying alternatives, people whose cognitive dissonance was unsettled by seeing the CCTV might support that, and the tax can go up and the alternatives can take over the niche. To a tiny extent, it's already happening.
Yeah, I think that's like another big way that we can make a step forward and get more people at least aware, because awareness is the key to actually doing something and caring and wanting to make a change. I think anything that is exposing what's happening and putting up these glass walls, so to speak, is a positive thing. And I think hopefully we're not all psychopaths, and hopefully more people will be inspired to do something, take action in their own way, whatever that might be for them.
Just to comment, going in the same idea, there is the petition right now to put the movie Dominion on Netflix, which you might know, the movie Dominion.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you can find that, I highly recommend you sign it. It would be, it contains images that are filmed in Canada and are images that are used of how animals are farmed all around the world. It's very, very graphic, but it's quite efficient. And there is also the Nation Rising thing happening, which you probably have heard of, in Ottawa, which, if you want to go, it's a manifestation for people to ask the government to stop subsidies to the animal agriculture in Canada. So if you don't want to pay, if you're not a psychopath, don't want to pay for that, might be a good idea to go. Yeah, it was just a comment also. The talking to drivers that are driving trucks and to workers is such efficient. Like it is so efficient because these people hate their jobs and are often very socially ill-equipped and are bad at finding jobs. So talking to them and offering jobs or stuff like that can be a very efficient way to let them have a better life.
And also those stories, like when you come to a vigil and there's a former slaughterhouse employee there speaking up for the animals and advocating in the same way we are, I think it inspires a lot of other people, because then they're realizing, oh, it's so bad that someone from within the industry is actually speaking out and actively advocating against it. It definitely has a bigger kind of wave of impact on other people too. So yeah, that's why I think we got to liberate all the beings that are inside these places, because they're all suffering in one way or another.
Did I end on an upbeat note? It's been a bit of a downer here. They always have these series of shows, best pizza in New York and best poutine in Montreal. Well, caught one the other day that was the best Philly cheesesteak. And so, this fellow who, claimed himself to be an expert on Philly cheesesteaks sampled 15 of them. And at one point in the middle of the show, he says, "Oh, well, I suppose I was going to get one of these, but this is not going to make the top 3. It's a vegan cheesesteak. So the steak is vegan, the cheese is vegan. There's no egg products in the bread." And he takes a bite of it and he goes, "Holy shit." And they bleep that out, right? He said, "Boy, am I surprised. This thing is damn good." So I think that there's some questions that people have about moving in that direction that it's not palatable. It can be made palatable.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I mean, half of my time I spend working with institutions to help them offer more plant-based options, because I think there's still this idea that, yeah, eating vegan can be boring or tasteless, or you'll be hungry after 20 minutes, or, it's hard to do or whatnot. But I'm lucky I get to spend time with chefs in kitchens, teaching them how to make more plant-based dishes with an actual chef. That's not me. But we guide them through making plant-based dishes that they can offer on their campuses to different students. It's primarily universities and colleges that we work with now, but it's really fun to see how people, their minds just completely open to how different plant-based eating can be compared to what they think. So, it can take a little bit of a step outside your comfort zone if you're not familiar with that, but you can be really surprised about the options that are out there right now.
There's also some research that's done. I'm not up on it enough to be really authoritative, but there's some feelings that the sorts of sensationalistic materials that you showed us is not effective. It turns people off. It makes them angry. They shut down. More persuasive, I think, is the guy with the cheesesteak, with the vegan cheesesteak, because what you're looking for is a combination between appealing to moral and ethical standards balanced against economic and financial standards, which are extremely complex. Philosophical positions with regard to a delicate balance, a utilitarian point of view, the acknowledgement that you're talking to one industry in one country with almost 200 countries around the world, each of them having their own particular orientations toward food and life and suffering. And I think you understand, how complex these issues are. But I don't think, just from my understanding of the literature, that the sensationalistic stuff is particularly effective.
Let's see the data.
Yeah.
Well, there are some data on this, and Riana knows it. She can tell you. They tend not to be effective.
More effective than whips, basically, in opinion and behavior change. That's not to say that they're not effective.
Yeah.
It's just they're more effective.
And I think we had a little bit of a conversation about this last night. Just that, I think there's a lot of different things that are going to work for different people. And so the more diverse that we can be in our approaches, to reach a wider audience, there's different groups that focus on different things. And together as a movement, we try to do every avenue possible in hopes that we'll eventually reach everybody, right? Because it's true that what works for one person is not going to work for another. Videos like the one that we saw earlier is what worked for me, but I recognize that, sharing a vegan meal with my friends might be more encouraging and convincing for them.
Yeah, I mean, basically same thing. And the reason why I do what I do and we use the content that we do and we keep filming it is because it keeps getting results. Every day I'm helping someone go vegan, or I'm helping someone eliminate cruelty from their diet. And so as long as that keeps happening, I'm going to keep using this method.
Cool.
We have 1 minute. Do you have one quick statement to make at the end?
Yeah, I just wanted to say what we already touched upon. It's if you don't care for animals, you should care maybe for your fellow humans. And any slaughterhouse is exploiting its workers. I live in the US at the moment, and there's a big issue. I don't know what the situation is in Canada, but in the US they employ a lot of illegal immigrants. And they get injured, they have no compensation, they have horrible working hours. So there are actually documentaries about that, and it's shocking. So anybody who cares about humans at least should not consume meat because, or any animal products, because every animal ends up in those slaughterhouses.
Okay, thank you very much.